Hi everybody. I just popped in a little bit early to make sure everything was working. If anybody's watching, if you can see my screen, just make a comment so I know this is working out. Cool. Hi, Zach. Okay, I'll get started here in just a couple of moments. Just wait for people to appear. Okay, so it says 3 people are watching it, so that must mean that if something is wrong, no one's saying anything. So that's, I guess, a good sign. Is the sound all right? Can you guys hear the sound pretty well? Is there any interference with audio, or is it okay? Hi, everybody. Okay, so I guess I will go ahead and get started then if nobody has any objections to that, given that it's now 4 o'clock. Today's presentation is just going to be about phonology and orthography, just a basic introduction to those concepts. I'm going to try to make it so you can see my face. There it is. Hopefully that's not too weird looking. I guess I can make it smaller. Maybe I can't. Okay, well, hopefully this will be all right. So for today's workshop, this is the 5th workshop for LDTC and ELP collaboration. Today's going to be about, like I said, phonology and orthography, or otherwise said, sound systems of a language and the writing system of a language. So let's get started then. So today's objectives are to have a few practical concepts of phonology for language documentation. This is not anything to do with phonological theory, but it is just for sort of practical usage when you're just getting started learning to document a language. The main objective here is to understand the concept of a language-specific sound system, or a phonology, that is the sound system that is sort of exclusive to one language itself. And related to that is how a writing system might represent the sound system. Writing system here referred to with the term orthography. And these things are relevant because you will want to have a sort of comprehensive documentation of a language, and that includes understanding the sound system, as well as thinking about whether there is or should be a writing system that can be really useful in creating language materials, especially for language teaching and pedagogy. So those are some of the reasons that this kind of thing can be important in language documentation. Okay, moving on. A phonology should include a sound inventory, and the sound inventory specifically is a list of all the different contrastive sounds in a language. So what I mean by contrastive is that you can have a sound in a word that if you were to replace it with another sound, it would change the meaning of the word. So it's a meaningful distinction for that language and sound. So what counts as one sound? Something that the speakers of the language perceive as one sound. So if you have sounds that sound a little bit different to you, but maybe to the speakers of that language, they consider to be the same, then it's one sound for as far as everything counts in that language. Basically, we tend to talk about two different types of sounds. In languages, we talk about consonants, which are sounds that restrict the flow of air, and vowels that shape the airflow, but they don't restrict it as much. So those are our two kind of basic units in terms of language sounds. An important point is that a sound is not the same as a letter. Sometimes a letter can represent a sound, but it doesn't always have a one-to-one correspondence. Sounds are things that you hear, and letters are basically parts of the written language. So they can have a relationship, but they may not be one-to-one. So sometimes you get a sound that corresponds to two or more letters, and sometimes you get a letter that corresponds to two or more sounds. So it's not always one-to-one. So some examples of sounds versus letters that you can see in English. English is particularly notorious for having a lack of one-to-one sound and letter relationship. For example, when you see these bolded words here with T's and C's and steeple, you see three different ways of writing the same sound. So the same sound here is E, but you see different ways of actually spelling them. So there's the EI combination, the EA, and the EE combination. So here's an example of two letters and two different sets of letters that represent one sound. Same thing in you, who, and glue, as well as in to, shoe, and flew. So all of these have the same basic sound of oo, but they have a difference in terms of how they're being spelled. So these are things to watch out for. They're especially prominent in English, where they're all over the language in terms of differences between spelling and actual pronunciation. So one thing you can do is you can check the spelling of the word and see how it lines up to the actual pronunciation of it. So if you can say each of these words backwards, not by letter, but by sound, you can start to think a little more easily about what sounds are in a word versus what letters are used to spell the word. Let me check to see if there's any other comments. Okay, good. Cool. I will check back to see comments if you guys need. Okay, so if you look at these words, a lot of these sounds, like the sh sound, are actually spelled with two letters, and that's called a digraph. And digraphs are a set of two letters that actually produce one sound. So if you were to look at shush in English, what do you think it would be if you pronounced it backwards? Usually you look at letters, but here we're trying to think about sounds. So shush backwards comes out as, unsurprisingly, shush. Meme has this silent E on the end, so that's kind of a problem. But if you were to look at it with just sound, you'll realize that meme backwards is just meme. This silent E might throw you off. Backs. This is an interesting example because we have the CK combination, which is just representing one sound, the K sound. So if you say it backwards, it becomes scab. Skates. Backwards, right, becomes steaks. So it becomes another word, in fact. And steam pronounced backwards, not by letter but by sound, it becomes meets. And scoff, if you pronounce it backwards, becomes fox. And notice that fox, of course, has an X, not this C or S combination. So sometimes the letters and the pronunciation can throw you off. So another kind of little test to look at whether you're paying attention to sounds versus letters is to look at these kind of short words and think about how many sounds are in the following words. In the word see, of course we see 3 letters, right? But if you think about it, really, the EA is representing one sound, E. That's just one vowel. And the S is representing S. So in the end, you get 2 sounds, S and E. Stick obviously has 5 letters, but if you think about the sounds, it has 4 sounds. Once again, you see CK representing just one sound. Mix is a little bit the opposite. The X kind of does double duty, where it represents both the K and the S type of sound. So if you were to say how many sounds are in mix, you'd come up with probably 4. And good, once again, we see English using more letters than maybe it would have to in other circumstances, if it were another language. Where it has these 2 O's, but really they're representing one sound. So in the end, you could say that the word good has 3 sounds. Okay, let me check on everybody. Okay, cool, still working. Okay, so what do we do about this problem of corresponding letters to sounds and the fact that it doesn't always correspond very well in some languages? Well, linguists kind of get around this issue by using something called the IPA, or the International Phonetic Alphabet. And the IPA is really nice because it's a consistent way of representing the sounds of language. You have one-to-one correspondence between sounds and symbols. So if you have one letter in the IPA, that's always going to be one sound. If you have one sound, that's always going to be one letter. You don't have to worry about these digraphs, these 2 letters that mean one sound and one sound represented by 2 letters or whatever it is. It's similar to musical notation in that it should be accessible to anyone who's learned it. So like if you know how to read music, then you will know how to play a song that's written in the musical notation. You don't have to have ever heard it, actually. You should be able to play it if you know how the system works. It's the same thing in IPA. If you know what each symbol, which sound each symbol represents, theoretically, you should be able to know how it's pronounced. Now, whether or not you can actually produce those sounds yourself is another issue. I'm pretty bad at some of them. Other ones I'm fine at, so that's kind of a separate issue. But the idea is that you should know what that sound really is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be like guessing, like it is sometimes with certain English words, where it's just like, well, I don't know what that could be. It could be E or A or A or ah or a bunch of different things depending on the situation. It's always going to be one thing. And so it's nice in that respect because you can always rely on it. So here is a pretty big chart. And this chart, I will move my face around a little bit so you can see the whole thing. This chart is represents the consonants. Now, these are not the consonants of one language. These are all the consonants that you pretty much see in languages across the world. And now no language is going to have all of these. So English doesn't have all these sounds. French doesn't have all these sounds. Taiwanese doesn't have all these sounds, etc. It's just sort of this is all the possibilities that you could get. And so linguists like to use these symbols to represent sounds in languages that they are working on, or in order to make it so that you could write down the sounds of a language without having to know the spelling system. So it looks pretty crazy and complicated, but it's actually not too bad once you realize the ones that you actually need to use for your language. So if I were to use the ones for English, I would eliminate a whole bunch of these because they just don't occur in English. Like English just doesn't have a h sound really, or a k, for example. But this is the sort of range of what you can get. This is the range of possibility for world's languages. And likewise, I mentioned the consonants up here. The consonants are actually grouped by place, which is where in the mouth they are produced. So over here you have the bilabials, which are produced with the lips, like P and M and all those different types of ones. And then you go farther back and back into the mouth. So by the time you get back here, you're at the glottal place, which is where H's take place, like huh, ahead, and hand. It's way back down here near the glottis, in sort of the back of your mouth. So this is kind of from the front of the mouth backwards. And this, the different rows versus columns, the rows are essentially how the sound is made. Like, what's the manner of articulation? Like, how did you do it? So nasals, basically, you might know, are like N and M, and that is made with some air flowing out through the nose as well as the mouth. So these different rows basically tell you how it's made, and these columns tell you where it's made. So it's kind of like how and where. And likewise, we have the vowels. So those are the consonants, and these are the vowels. And there aren't quite as many different vowels, symbols to memorize as there are for consonants. And once again, just like with consonants, you're not going to have a language that has all of these in it. That would be a pretty unusual language. You might have 5 vowels, like some languages. You might have 7. You might even just have 3. Some languages don't have a whole lot of contrast in vowels. Some have a lot of contrast, like English or Dutch or German has a lot of different vowels. But basically, the way the vowels are set up is this shape is called a trapezoid. It's kind of wider on the top and skinnier on the bottom. And this kind of represents the space inside your mouth. And you have here, this dimension is open to close. So this is with your mouth more open, slowly closing it until it's closed. So up here you have ah, where your mouth is open, as you can see, ah. And then if you close your mouth, you go all the way up to E, which is closed, with your mouth most closed. Now this dimension is how in the front or back part of your mouth. Whether it's in the front part, like E, or whether it's produced farther back, like ooh. Here's ooh, for example. Ooh, all the way up to E, is sliding, like one of those little slide pipes that sometimes you could play with as a kid. They have like a little thing that you pull in and out of the little whistle as you blow on it, and it makes a different sound. That's kind of like what's going on when you go ooh, ooh. You pull your tongue back to make the ooh, push it all the way up to the front to make the E. So that's kind of the 2 dimensions of the vowel space that are represented here. And of course, nobody's mouth is this shape. This is just kind of an abstraction based on how the mouth really is. Okay, so now that we have the IPA at our disposal, it's kind of nice because now we can start writing words and knowing how to pronounce them based on how we wrote it. So there's no need for confusion of like spelling or how it's, you know, how you're going to interpret certain symbols. You know, if you're using the IPA, you're going to know what it is. So with C, the English word C, can be written in IPA with these symbols, C. And as you can notice, there is 1 sound per symbol. There's nothing extra and nothing gets left out at the same time. So that's very nice, I think. Here we have stick. Notice that the vowel in stick and C is different, so we have a different symbol. This is I, the little tiny capital I, and this is E. Likewise, we have mix. We don't use the X because that's actually got 2 sounds in it. We split them up so each sound gets a letter or a symbol, and each symbol gets a sound. With good, we reflect the fact that it's just got the 1 vowel, the 1 vowel, with this little symbol right here that looks sort of like a little pot. Upsilon. But yeah, I think it looks like a pot or a horseshoe. If you want to go to listen to an interactive IPA chart, you can go to this address right here, ipachart.com. And I don't think I will play it because it won't come out from my speakers onto my other um, microphone. So it won't do you any good. But if you want to, feel free to go to this address, and it's fun to play with because you can click on all the different sounds or symbols, and that you can hear what sound they make. So you won't be able to hear it when I do it, but right now it's basically just saying oh, and now this one's saying so you can click on all of these if you want to and hear the different sounds and the symbols that line up with them. And don't worry about like memorizing any of these. It's not really necessary at this point in time. This is like a huge mess of symbols, right? Basically just know the concept behind like, you know, there are ways to represent sounds that aren't as messy as, for example, English spelling, which is kind of a nice thought no matter what position you're coming from. It kind of makes things a little cleaner and simpler. So that's how linguists like to write down sounds, essentially. Like I said before, no one language has all these sounds. That's just that chart I showed you is just like the maximum possibility of what you might see across the world. It's important when you're looking at an individual language to find every sound that contrasts or encodes difference in meaning. So that's going to depend on the language. So like in English, we would say that D sound and T sound contrast because you get like tag. Well, that's not a good example. Where you get like T versus D. Those are two different sounds. Or tip versus dip. And those are two different words. They have different meanings. So that would be an example of sounds that contrast in English in particular. But in another language, they might not contrast. That other language might not care about the way that T and D are different. Basically, when you look at sounds that contrast, you want to look for sounds that are in words that are otherwise the same. So like dip and tip, those are called minimal pairs. So if you look into whatever language you're working on, you can find words that are only different by one sound. And if that makes a difference in meaning, it usually means you found a minimal pair. So what do I mean by this exactly? Examples in English are bat and pat, book and cook, sit and seat. So these only differ by one sound. These two by the consonants, and this one by the vowel. You have two different. So what this can show us is that the speakers of that language recognize that if you change that sound, you get a different word. Like that is a different word with a different meaning. And that means you have found a contrastive sound for that language. It's like one of the keys to building your phonemic inventory, which is like your collection of the important sounds for the language. You know it's something that matters and something that is different. So if you were to say bat versus pat, and they were like, oh no, that's the same word, don't worry about it, it's just different ways of saying it, then you would know, oh, well, I guess that contrast doesn't exist, it doesn't matter. But if you're talking about English, for example, and you were like bat versus pat, and someone said, yeah, those are different words, different meaning, you can't switch them around, then you know that's a key difference. And like I said, different languages will contrast different sounds. So in English, you have a slightly different type of T sound if you say stay versus tay. There's a little puff of air for the second one, but not for the first. Stay versus tay. Now, in many languages, that might be a crucial difference. But in English, it's not really that crucial. It doesn't really make two different sounds from the language's perspective or from the speaker's perspective. It doesn't matter which one you use. You might just sound a little funny if you use one versus the other in certain places, but it's not a contrastive difference. Some more examples of minimal pairs. In English, the L in leaf and the L in feel are not contrastive, even though they sound different. Even though they technically seem different, and when you think about it, they are different, they don't contrast in the language. Like the language doesn't care, so to speak, how they are different. If you say the word leaf, you can feel in your mouth that the L is kind of up behind your teeth on the top. Leaf. Leaf. But if you say feel, you can tell that the L is kind of going back in your mouth, kind of back where your soft palate is back there. Feel, leaf, feel. So those L's are technically different, but the English language doesn't consider them different enough to like matter, right? It doesn't really consider those different things. They're just L's, both L's. But if you had another language, that might be a very different sound. It might be written with a different letter because they think of it as a different thing altogether. If you were to say leaf versus leaf, you might get two different words. One might mean like, I don't know, banana or something, and the other one means leaf. So you have to consider the language itself, basically. An example of the opposite, however, is like an English F sound in leaf and the V sound in leave. Those do contrast because you get different meanings, right? Leave is not just an alternate way of saying the word leaf. Like that's a totally different word. But like I said, another language might not care about that. It might just be like the same thing. Like, oh yeah, two different versions, but it's basically the same sound. So this is part of why it can be hard to learn the phonology or the sound system of a language you're not familiar with. Is because you have to learn whether stuff contrasts or is important all over again. So some examples are between Hindi and Urdu consonants. These are two languages that contrast different types of stops that English does not contrast. So if you go to this website, this is just Wikipedia, phonology on Hindustani, you can see, you may have to play it for yourself, but you can see down here, there are different types of stops, stop consonants, so like T's and D's and such things like that. They have a contrast between what are called dental stops and retroflex stops. Now this is not a contrast that is important for English, but it is important for Hindi. So if you click on these, you can play them and they will show you examples. And see if you can tell the differences between the first consonant on these words versus the retroflex stops. So these are some examples of a language that has a difference of sound that is not necessarily recognized for all other languages. Sometimes you can say things that are not exactly consonantal or vowel specifically, but might be tone. Tone is a thing that happens in language, basically the kind of pitch that occurs on words. And languages can contrast tone, that is, have different types of tone that make words mean different things, such as in Mandarin or Cantonese. There are often languages in Africa that use tone to distinguish different words. And so here you can see the tone indicated above the A of ma. And all of these different mas, which I will not try to pronounce and mess up for you, indicate a different word altogether. But the main distinguishing factor here is the tone, not the consonant or the vowel itself, but the tone on the vowel. So this is something that you might have in the language that you're working on as well. There can be up to like 6 contrasting tones in Cantonese, or as few as 2 in some African languages. So depending on whether your language has tone or not, all these different words might mean something different. I believe you can click here to hear the differences as well. Yeah, this leads you to a YouTube. So I won't play it because it won't make a difference to you guys. But you may have been wondering about sign languages.
Hello everyone, welcome to Alpha Chinese. This is Teacher Icon.
Which, hold on just a second. Yeah, so sign languages also have phonology, just like spoken languages. And the elements of sign phonology are not related to sound, obviously, but rather to the shapes and movements and the visual cues associated with sign language. So there are these 5 different elements that are generally thought to make up sign phonology. And those are location, so like where the hand is in regards to the rest of the body. The hand shape, basically what shape your hand is in. The orientation, like how the hand is facing, like this. The movement that you make with the hand. And non-manual expression, so some type of facial expression that is not expressed through the hand itself, like is rather on the face. So just like spoken languages have sort of phonological elements of like where in the mouth are you making the sound, how are you making the sound, so do sign languages have different elements that determine the phonemes of their language. So for example, some minimal pairs in sign languages. In ASL, American Sign Language, these are 2 words, which are a minimal pair, funny and sugar, the terms for these. And they only differ by the location of the sign on the rest of the body. So since I don't have to play sound for these, I will click and see if we can get an example here of the word for funny. So here's the location, right in front of the nose and face. And to contrast it, the word for sugar So as you can see, this one is the same movement, orientation, hand shape, everything. It's just in a different place. So it's below the chin rather than up in front of the nose. So I'll go back to funny, right up in front of the nose and mouth. And then here, its minimal pair sugar is a little bit lower. So this tells you that the placement, the location of the sign is a crucial factor to determining whether whether your sign is going to mean funny or sugar. Some other minimal pairs in ASL. Take a look at white versus like. And here is like, sign for like. So as you can see, the differentiating factor here is hand shape. It happens in the same location, but the hand shape is different. So this is an example of another minimal pair in a signed language. So one thing that you can do as an activity to kind of get your bearings in the language that you're working on documenting is to try to find some minimal pairs in a language. If you don't know how to write them using the IPA yet, that's fine. You don't need to. Just try to find some words in your language that differ only by one segment or one phoneme, one sound. Things like bat and pat in English, book and cook, sit and seat, tip and dip in English, pair and rare, or scare and stare in English. So if you can find some of those that contrast they only differ in one sound, then that is a really helpful clue to identifying those sounds as phonemes, distinctive, contrastive sounds that are important in distinguishing meaning in the language. And if you can find any in the language you're working on, feel free to share them in the chat if you'd like to. Do you have any interesting sounds that you feel are unique, or symbols used in the writing system that you find unusual or distinctive in some way? Or do you have any kind of issues with what minimal pairs are, or what counts as a minimal pair? I will go back to the chat and see if anyone has any more examples here. Here we go. Yeah, talking about the Swedish Sign Language with lots of signs that don't differ except for the non-manual signals. So the importance of focusing on the lips and not just the hands when you're using the language. Yeah, Zach brings up a good point of looking for rhyming words. That can be really helpful. Like tip and dip is basically what I did. Sat and rat, two different ones. So if you can find any other types in your language, let us know in the comments. And there's probably a huge list of minimal pairs for English that you could look up. I'm going to see if I can find it, just to give you more examples. I bet there's like a minimal pair. I don't even know, database. Probably are a ton. And let me know if you have any other questions or comments or anything. Yeah, here's a whole ton of them. Here's ones that contrast different consonants. So beep and peep, bag and peg, park and bark, teach versus peach. And these just show you the sounds that English considers crucial to differentiate between. There's a whole lot of these things. So if you can find any things like this in other languages, that is a very nice clue that that is an important sound that should be considered when you're talking about the phonology of that language. Like, what would be a description of English if we didn't talk about S or B? Those are crucial, right? The difference between S and Z, or the difference between P and B, is something that is necessary to consider for the language. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Some great examples already. Carro versus carro. Oh, awesome. Great examples. Yeah, if they make a difference in meaning, you know that you're onto something, because otherwise, might not be a difference in meaning. Like I can say tin and tin in English, but they're just two types of tea, so it's just kind of saying it the same way. Pero, perro. Nice. Yeah, so this is one way of really understanding how to get at what sounds you're working with. What are you dealing with in the language you're working on? What is important to document? What's important to put in a phonemic inventory? And if you're going to learn to work with the IPA, you will know then what symbols to use to describe the language. So for example, if I were to write bat versus pat in English, I would choose B, and then I would go up to this vowel right here and choose a. Then I would go down to T. But if I was writing pat, right, I would choose a P instead. So that would be some of the symbols I would use to write the English words bat and pat. Oh, some Iasa from Anna, thank you. Very nice. Brother versus shark. That seems like an important distinction. Capelli versus capelli. Nice. I want to try to pronounce all these because I know I'll ruin them and defeat the purpose. Bois Fijian, nice, cool. Nepali, Kasi, Nihmong. There's a minimal septuplet, a set of 7 words differing only in tone. That is super cool. Kind of perfect for the tone examples. I'll give a couple in the language I work on, which is Kala, which is spoken in Papua New Guinea. There's a word for uncle that contrasts with the word for canoe. And the word for canoe has a nasalized vowel, wan versus wa, which is uncle. Another one is tooth versus stone. O versus ah. There's only one sound to it, but still counts, right? Really nice examples, everybody. Yep. Malabar Creole Portuguese. Nice. Okay, great. Great examples, everyone. Okay, so is everyone more or less clear on the concept of the minimal pair at this point, or any questions on that, or any need to clarify what that's about, or are we okay? If we seem okay on that, please keep your minimal pairs examples coming if you would like. I like to see all of them, and they're very cool. And they help me learn about languages I don't know anything about. So I will move on, though, briefly, if that's okay for everyone, to the next part of this. So what do we do once we have the sounds figured out? Well, closely connected to sounds are writing, as we've seen. Sounds can be represented by writing. Oops. Oh. They can be represented by writing. They can also be represented in different ways by writing. So you can write something in different ways and still have the same sounds, but different letters that come out. So orthography is basically, all that means is a writing system, a way of writing. So English has an orthography that is what we call opaque, aka confusing. So there's a lot of inconsistencies and different like complex ways of representing one sound that is not always consistent, to put it mildly. So why is it important to have an orthography at all? Why would you want to write a language down? Well, there are several reasons for that, besides some of them that you might think of as obvious. One reason is that a writing system that everyone supports can create a lot of cohesion in the community. It can create a sense of unity within a speaker community, and if everybody agrees on how it should be, that is something that creates a sense of basically just oneness in the community and support for the language. It can also increase the prestige with which a language is viewed. Basically, like a coolness factor, or how spiffy everyone views the language. It's like, well, it does have this nice writing system, so that's pretty cool. That makes me want to use it. I can write stuff down in that language, and that's a plus because I like to, write grocery lists and poems and songs and letters and signs on the wall. So there's a lot of useful stuff you can do with it, and also in a lot of communities see written languages as more suitable for school environments, for teaching the language, for teaching in the language. So if you have a way of writing the language down, it really helps with being able to increase its usage in all kind of respects throughout the community. Not just school, of course, but school included, and that's often a really big thing for for language conservation or revitalization is being able to use it with kids in school or with adults in school. So what are some types of orthography of writing systems? So there's kind of three main types that we think about in linguistics. There's logographic systems, syllabaries, and alphabets. Alphabets are, for example, what you would see in English. Some examples of logographic systems are a lot of the Chinese writing systems. So basic principle of a logographic system is that you have one symbol per morpheme, and a morpheme is just basically a unit of meaning. It can be a word or it can be a part of a word. So if you have one symbol, one morpheme, rather than symbols for each sound, it is more like the concept of the morpheme itself. So one practical challenge to this is that it can take a really long time to learn. So if you want to read a Chinese newspaper, you typically need to know 2,000 to 3,000 symbols. So that takes a lot of time and education and practice to be able to do. So that is one type of system that is out there. Another type of system that exists is the syllabary. The syllabary is essentially based on the syllable, as you might be able to tell from the name. A well-known example is Japanese. Japanese hiragana and katakana are both syllabaries. The basic principle is one symbol per syllable. So if you look at the names of these, you see hiragana, katakana. So each syllable is one symbol. If you want to figure out what the syllables are, sometimes you can do the tapping test, where you basically tap or clap in time with the word, and that can help you figure out how many syllables are there. So if I were to do it with these words, hiragana, katakana. So you can see that they both have 4 syllables. This works best, obviously, if your language has an easy syllable structure. It would be pretty difficult to use a syllabary for English and have it be strictly right, because English syllables can be really complex, and you'd have to have a different symbol for each one of those complex symbols, or syllables, that is. So it works better for certain languages in the end than it does for others. Inuktitut is another language that uses a syllabary. Finally, we get to alphabets. This is the type of writing system that English and many other languages use. The basic principle is to have one symbol per phoneme or distinctive sound. But as we've seen in the beginning of the presentation, it's not always the case with English, especially in other languages too, where often you get things like digraphs, which is 2 symbols per sound, and other kinds of things that basically complicate the spelling or the use of the alphabet. But that is the basic principle behind alphabets, is that it is one symbol to one sound. This is one of the most common types of writing systems across languages. There are different alphabets out there, obviously. There's the Roman alphabet, which is used to write many different languages, not just Latin, right, but English, Italian, French, all kinds of languages. Even languages that are spoken in vastly different parts of the world have picked up the Roman alphabet to use for the languages, like the Kala language in Papua New Guinea that I work with uses the Roman alphabet to write their language with a few modifications. We have the Greek alphabet, we have Cyrillic alphabet, so used for like Russian, Bulgarian, etc. And they all have different symbols and different values to the letters. But across languages, even within the same alphabet, you can get different values to different letters, and so they don't always work the same. That's why spelling works differently in Italian than it does in English, differently in Russian to Bulgarian. Even though they use the same alphabet, there are still differences in how it's used exactly. So what if your language doesn't have an official orthography? That's not a problem. You can develop a working orthography for the language you're working with. Um, if you are doing this, there's a few things to keep in mind when developing the orthography. It's a whole lot easier to start out simple. It's probably not a great idea to go full English right away and be like, I'm going to make these three vowels actually pronounce one vowel sound just for the heck of it, because it's harder to learn. Like we all know, English spelling is not the easiest to learn. It's confusing. It has problems. But when you're creating your own working orthography, you don't have to go through any of that if you don't want to, essentially. And I mean, the best idea is to kind of not, because it gets real hairy real quick. One sound to one symbol is usually best. Just keep it simple. There's some practical matters to think of when you're developing how to write. How are you going to make it compatible with different technologies? Because like everybody's using computer and phone these days. So do you want to put a lot of symbols that are difficult to write and type? Or do you want to keep it simple to the basic letters of the Roman alphabet, to the basic, I don't know, katakana if you're using that? Or do you want to add modifications? How hard are those modifications going to be to implement? Like if I'm texting in this language, am I going to have to stop and put a bunch of special symbols? Is that annoying? Will people end up leaving those out in the end? So there's just some practical concerns to think about when you are developing these kinds of things, and it's always best to keep the real speakers involved. Involving real language users is usually the best way to come to a system that works well for everybody and is practical and makes everybody happy in the end. So if your language already has an official orthography, sometimes it's interesting to think about how that might have come about and how it's changed over time. I guess English is an extreme example of how an orthography can change over time due to the influences of all kinds of things. But over time, language sounds change, and sometimes the writing system doesn't change as fast as the sounds do. So you end up with some inconsistencies just spanning the ages after you've written your language down for a long time. But that is one reason that it's nice to develop orthographies, is that you don't have to make it complicated. You can make it simple, logical, and user-friendly to the speakers and writers of the language. So these are just some basic ideas to keep in mind if you're working with spelling systems for a language, if you're documenting a language that doesn't really have an orthography, or if everybody kind of writes it a little bit differently, but everyone's trying to develop something for permanent usage. These are just things to keep in mind related to the sound system, as well as the usually soon to follow writing system that is often connected in some way to the sound system. So if everybody has any questions, please let me know. That's the end of my slides. I will give you guys a link to the slides if you'd like to review those. The slides have links to all the different resources that I clicked on to show you all. If you are interested in any of that, just let me know. I think I should be able to share the slides through some of the LDTC directors, and you should be able to share it out to everybody. But yeah, please let me know if you have more comments or questions in the comments here on Facebook, and I can try to address any questions. But other than that, I will probably log off here and wish everybody a nice afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. It is almost 5 p.m. for me here. I'm just out of Honolulu, Hawaii. So the sun is getting low in the sky. But whatever time it is for you, I hope you enjoyed this brief and pretty simple presentation, just introducing some of the basic concepts of sounds and letters, and how you can approach that when you are documenting a language or working with your own language, however you may choose to do that. But hopefully everybody enjoyed this, and I will now attempt to put down to log off of here correctly, if I can do it. and wish everybody a pleasant day or night. So goodbye, everyone.